The invisible government that rules you, that you don't know but you know it exists. That even in the most liberal of democracies is not elected, that even in the most rotating of governments remains, that even in the most multi-party countries continues in power regardless of who wins the election. We're not talking about big conspiracies, but rather something very mundane that has existed for thousands of years. Meet him, the powerful and discreet deep state, or Estado Profundo in Portuguese. People often talk about the deep state here and the deep state there, as if it were a plot from a mystery or thriller movie, but it's not. It's something simpler than people imagine, but no less influential and powerful because of that. But before we get into that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. Also, follow us on Instagram and Telegram to stay updated with channel news. Your support is very important for the World Geopolitics channel to keep going. I'm World Geopolitics and this is my channel. For older people, the deep state brings to mind the secret government, in the style of The X-Files, a conspiracy theory series from the 90s that influenced a lot of pop culture at the time. The parallel government that decides and influences from the shadows and sometimes even eliminates potential opponents. So, the concept of deep state is often used by conspiracy theorists to justify some abnormality, or it's used as a joke by skeptics. And in a way, both sides are right and wrong at the same time. The deep state is that group of bureaucratic public officials and people in extremely strategic positions in the government. That's all. But don't underestimate that that's all, because that all is already a lot. And because they are public servants, they are not elected through electoral processes. And because they are in strategic positions, they have the power to make the public machine move or stall. Because they have been there for a long time and have gained a lot of experience and networks, they have a lot of influence. And because they are bureaucrats, they don't attract public attention. And the problem is that you can't just replace them. I'm not just talking about the social and political capital they have with their connections and networks, but they are the ones who know the administrative details of the state. Imagine if during every election the president of the country, in this case Brazil, had to replace all administrative staff at the Federal Police, Brazilian Institute of Environment and Renewable Natural Resources, or the Central Bank. The public administration would lose at least a year just selecting new employees, and another year getting them up to speed on the situation. And even so, a lot of information and data would be lost during this transfer, and eventually the entire term of that government would end up wasted because of the time lost. So, there's not much you can do. The deep state, you just have to live with it. Government leaders do occasionally replace one or another member of the deep state. But this whole system simply can't be done. It's something unreal. And all countries have this caste of administrative officials, from dictatorships to the most liberal democracies. From small countries to the largest, whether in territorial size, economy, or population, they are what we can call the inevitable force of geopolitics. Not because they are part of something that was planned like a conspiracy, but because they are a consequence of the very existence of the state. Bureaucracy will always exist because it is what organizes the numbers, the data, the flow, and the dynamics of the state. But of course, different countries will have different bureaucracies at different levels of efficiency. So this deep state will take different forms in each country. These permanent officials organize the state, and without them, no matter how good the president, the king, the prime minister, the emperor, or anything else is, he won't be able to govern. Well, if they want to hinder the government, they'll also be able to do that. Don't confuse the deep state with the country's elites either. Although in some cases they may have some connection, they are different things. The power of the deep state and these bureaucrats is so strong that it's not uncommon for them to conquer their own conquerors. In ancient Egypt, for example, what we could call the deep state would be the scribes and some priests. Until the 1911 revolution in China, mandarins and eunuchs held power. And in a way, they were responsible for these two civilizations lasting for thousands of years. When ancient Egypt was conquered by the Nubians, Hyksos, Assyrians, and even later by the Greeks, the cultural and civilizational heritage of the Egyptians was not wiped out because of the scribes. The foreign invaders, when dealing with Egypt, which was an extremely complex nation, as soon as they conquered the region, found themselves under enormous pressure. How do you govern such a developed society in such a complex territory? Where was food produced? Where was it stored? How long would the food supplies last? How many people would be fed? All of this was very hard to know, and only the scribes who managed the documents and official records knew those numbers and understood that organization. Killing them, imprisoning them, or removing them would mean managing that region blindly, which is unfeasible. So the conquerors deposed the elites but kept the scribes, and the scribes controlled this backbone of the empire. They were then able, little by little, let's say, to Egyptianize the foreigners, eventually pushing bureaucratic rules, behaviors, and protocols to be followed. So, in a matter of time, the foreign conquerors were actually following the rights and way of life of the locals. Ancient Persia. The public administration system of the Achaemenids was so efficient that only the Persian administrators and bureaucrats could see and understand everything that happened within the empire, which at the time was the largest in the world. So, as a result, it was a colossal task, especially in a time without telecommunications. Elites tied to the military nobility preferred to wage wars and left these more shocking matters. Well, not shocking. Persian bureaucratic administrators were so efficient that, as a result, the functioning of the imperial territory could only be carried out through these bureaucrats, except for Egypt, which, though conquered by the Persians, operated autonomously within their empire. This meant that when the troops of Alexander the Great and his Hellenic Empire conquered Persia, they ended up having to keep this body of bureaucrats. To sustain the economy and production of the newly conquered Persian Empire, and just like in Egypt, the Greeks over time began to follow Persian rituals more and more, so that years later it became a reason for complaint among some members of the Greek elite, as Alexander and his inner circle seemed less and less Greek and more Persian. We would see the same thing with China as well, as I mentioned before, in this case with the eunuchs and mandarins. The Chinese Empire and its territory were so vast that the conquerors, in order to enjoy the spoils, had to keep the Chinese bureaucrats if they wanted to gain any benefit from that conquest. It was literally a lot of people, a continental territory, an enormous variety of cultural diversity, and the nomads from the interior of Asia, the traditional conquerors of China, had never governed such large populations over such a vast expanse of land, so they had no experience in public administration. They were unmatched at waging war but struggled to hold on to their conquests. So, in order not to run into trouble, they kept the functioning structure of the state, or its deep state, the Chinese bureaucrats. In the Chinese case, there's an interesting particularity because in this case there were often disputes between groups to see who would be more important. Sometimes it was the mandarins, sometimes it was the eunuchs. The eunuchs, for those who don't know, are men who had part of their genitals removed. Sometimes just the scrotum, other times everything. But in Imperial China, these two groups often competed over who would have more influence over the emperor. And thanks to this Confucian administrative structure, we will see more or less similar models of deep state in the region where Korea, Vietnam, and Japan are today. And just like in the Persian and Egyptian cases, in the Chinese case as well. The nomadic conquerors, over time, started to speak Chinese. They dressed like the Chinese elite and followed royal rites and protocols influenced by Chinese bureaucrats. A strong example of this is the Mongol Empire itself, even though it was the most proportionally powerful empire in all of history. And when I say proportionally, I mean compared to the forces of their time. They ended up thinking, what I mean when I say proportionally again is compared to the other forces of their time. During the Roman Empire, the differences between Rome and the Parthian or Sassanid empires, both versions of the Persian Empire, were not significant. The balance of power leaned toward the Roman Empire, it's true, but only by a little. In fact, in the times when both empires engaged in war, the Persians came out on top most of the time. But, in terms of the world, the Han Empire in China, which existed during much of the same period as the Roman Empire, had numbers that surpassed the Romans. By far, whether it was in population, economic production, or even with a relative advantage in technological level, Britain, no matter how strong it was, always had some relative balance with the French Empire or the Russian Empire. Or, worse, when the German Empire emerged and even surpassed the British. So, the British advantage was small compared to the other powers of its time, but in the Mongol case, it wasn't. In the time of Genghis Khan, there was no nation or empire even remotely close to the power of the Mongols. And even they ended up being conquered by the very people they had once conquered, the Chinese. This was thanks to the bureaucrats who are, in fact, the deep state. I gave 3 examples, ancient Egypt, China, and Persia, just to show that we're not talking about something recent, but rather something that has existed for thousands of years. There have been many other historical examples, as I mentioned earlier. Every country has or has had a deep state. In Renaissance Italy, the Council of Ten in Venice, from the 14th to the 17th centuries, would also be an example. Secret of the Republic of Venice. Initially created to deal with threats of internal conspiracy within the Republic, but over time, however, it acquired almost absolute powers. Operating in a secret and discreet manner and controlling significant aspects of Venetian politics, often without the supervision of the Senate or the Doge. But then we have the present day, which is what interests us, and here we have aspects that didn't exist in ancient times. Because now, with the state apparatus being much larger than at any other period in history, this deep state has become much stronger than ever before. Add to that the power of the media and new technologies, and here things are going to take on a bit of a conspiratorial air, kind of like the X-Files, because it's something real, but not entirely. And what about after World War II and the blank checks that were given to military, research and intelligence budgets, in other words, for espionage? This was taken to much larger and much more efficient proportions than what existed until then. Today, the deep state is not just the bureaucrat who controls the government's books, it's also a parallel apparatus of power to the state, in the literal military sense. President Eisenhower further popularized the term when he discussed the American military-industrial complex in his 1961 farewell speech, warning about the disproportionate influence of industry, the defense industry, and the armed forces over national politics.
I come to you with a message of warning and farewell. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known by any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. The disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will continue. We must never allow the weight of this threat to endanger our freedoms. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can ensure proper integration. It can compel the proper balance between the vast defense machinery and our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Many years ago I made a video here about Operation Gladio, which is literally a case of the deep state. I'll leave the link as a pinned comment about this case so you can check it out later. In summary, during the Cold War, NATO intelligence trained civilians and distributed weapons across Western Europe. They hoped that if one day there was an invasion by the Soviet Union, these sleeper cells would carry out acts of terrorism inside the territory occupied by the Soviets. Until the day of the invasion, they would stay there, quiet, dormant, not drawing any attention. It would seem like a movie or television series script if it weren't for the fact that all of this was officially documented. The Soviet invasion never happened, but this civilian and military network was never officially dismantled. Maybe it was abandoned, ignored, or maybe it even still exists today. We have no way of knowing. But aside from investigations by some countries, we don't really know what happened to those trained people, and even less about the weapons that were scattered around, which obviously either got old and are useless now because they were abandoned. More than 30 years after the Cold War, they were either diverted or their fate is unknown. But in the name of fighting Soviet socialism, the military, scientists, and spies had an almost unlimited budget. Not only in the United States, but also in other NATO countries, Latin America, and Asia. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, with their allies in the Warsaw Pact, there was also this almost unlimited, or at least prioritized budget. All kinds of operations and research, no matter how absurd they were, ended up being allowed on both sides during the Cold War. And with so much money being poured out by the governments, a lot, really a lot, ended up going unsupervised. Which meant that not only was a lot of money wasted, but also that clandestine or at least controversial operations were carried out. Anyone who believes things were better in democracies than dictatorships is mistaken. J. Edgar Hoover, a founder of the FBI, led the agency for 38 years. He used his army of agents, surveillance equipment, huge budget, and freedom to fight communists to spy on everyone. Literally everyone, including senators, secretaries, and even the presidents of the United States themselves. It is known that he had files with the dirt on every big shot in Washington and used that to intimidate and blackmail them. If anyone threatened to fire him or blocked some operation he really wanted, he would reveal part of what he knew. Literally, every American president ended up bowing their head to him. It's said those dossiers would have when he died. How much of that is urban legend we'll never know, but we do know for a fact that yes, he really did have and keep all the public figures in his pocket. This is a classic example of how the deep state has more power than the elected and official government of a country. Because even the senators, as a group, and the president, with all his authority, ended up bowing to him. But it's likely worse than because one of the few defeats that J. Edgar Hoover had was the creation of the CIA. Until then, intelligence gathering activities, both internal and external, were carried out by the FBI. And did the idea of an agency exclusively for foreign espionage bother him? Because basically it would mean he would have to share the power he had. And in fact, the CIA followed this competing line, which diluted the FBI's power. So the competition between these agencies was intense. And that's important to understand. The different factions of the deep state compete and contend with each other. There isn't something homogeneous. But when someone from the outside threatens this system as a whole, they close ranks and protect themselves. The deep state isn't always as discreet as it is with the judiciary and the public prosecutor's office in Brazil, although historically, excessive exposure of some area of the deep state has ended up causing political and civil crises, which, when they didn't result in geopolitical ruptures, at least resulted in drastic governmental changes, with other sectors of the deep state then sacrificing the, let's say, exposed part to maintain at least the minimum existence of the functional system. So the concept of deep state isn't just a conspiracy theory. It actually represents a much more complex reality within the structures of governmental power. This phenomenon makes part of the state bureaucracy and permanent institutions demonstrating enormous historical resilience, adapting to different political and cultural contexts over the centuries. But at the same time, the deep state has played a crucial role in maintaining administrative continuity even during periods of serious crisis. So, understand that the deep state is a consequence, not a plan. It's not something monolithic like a single group that controls everything, but rather several factions. They often compete for power, influence, and money behind the scenes in the government, but they also often cooperate. It's not really something good or evil, it would be more like a force of nature. In this case, a force of political nature, one of the inevitable forces of geopolitics. Their existence raises important questions about the nature of democracy, government transparency, and the limits of institutional power. But at the same time, it guarantees at least some minimum level of stability, even if many times in a controversial way. You don't destroy the deep state, at most you replace it with another one. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow us on other social media. And also consider becoming a member by joining. Not only will you get early access to the channel's videos, but you'll also have access to exclusive videos and live streams just for members. Plus, you'll be helping to keep the channel going. World Geopolitics. Hugs, see you next video.